It's always great being here amongst family and friends at S4. Being in this industry since 2001, 2002, it's always nice to see all the faces. So what we're going to talk about today is, oh, thanks a lot. That would be helpful. How to conduct security assessments on operational technology systems, ICS, which is usually like a whole day in our 5-day course, so I'm trying to boil it down to 45 minutes. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through all the slides. Hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end, but it's a lot of content. And this is just a little bit about Red Tiger Security. I'm going to let you guys read this on your own. You'll get the slides later. And it's always interesting when I go back and look at this because it's like I've been doing this since I was, I think, 23, 24 years old. And this is a passion of mine. I love doing security for industrial control systems. So if you have any questions about this stuff, happy to answer those. OK, so let's quickly look at why things changed. If you look at 1960s, 70s, 80s, these controllers had all proprietary interfaces, proprietary protocols. There was no industry standards, no use of Ethernet down there, no space, and typically no connection to the outside world. In the 1990s, I was working for Chevron as a SCADA engineer, and we started to see controllers shipping with RJ45 ports. Proprietary protocols started to be wrapped in TCP IP, and we started to see HMIs port over to Windows. I think one of the first HMIs that was Windows-based was Wonderware, and then you started to see all the rest of them come out. We also started to see HMIs and PLCs deployed on Ethernet, and at that time, since there was no standard about separation, guess what network those things got deployed on? Corporate networks, right? So fast forward to the first 10 years of the 2000s, we started seeing a full adoption of RJ45 on all controllers. Most protocols were encapsulated in TCP IP. Almost all of the operator workstations ported over to Windows. And we started to see some architecture models that would push you towards segregation. But really, there was very little regulatory requirement for this, and it was still just in the beginning. Then we go into the last 10 years, and now we see full adoption of RJ45, all protocols wrapped in TCP. And so now these systems look and feel just like an IT network now, and but they don't have all the security capabilities of an IT network. So now that our systems, our DCS systems, SCADA systems, look and feel and act like an IT network, we have to worry about a lot more than we had to in the past. And this just gives you a quick view back in time of the types of malware and attacks. And if you look at the start of this slide on the left-hand side, you'll see a lot of those systems that were affected by malware and threat actors. It was not the target system. These systems were not being targeted, but the way that they were connected to IT systems allowed them to be compromised. As we move down towards the right, you'll start to see a more focus from the adversary on finding ICS systems and writing specific exploits for those systems. So the point is, conditions are ripe now for a perfect storm because now we have systems that look and feel like IT systems based on the same protocols that are on the internet. They're connected more and more to other systems. Even though they look and feel like IT systems, they typically lack the security protections. I always will tell people, opening up an app on your phone like Facebook or Instagram and posting something has more security involved in that process than clicking on the ESD button on your plant HMI, because there is no encryption, there's no certificates. It's just sending an open, clear text command to a PLC. And lastly, field operations have grown dependent upon ICS systems. When I was a SCADA engineer working at Chevron, we could still drive in a pickup truck out to the plant and try to operate it manually. Try to do that now in 2020. And we scaled our workforce down so little that the ICS systems are the only way to operate now. So how do we approach the problem? This is a quick maturity model that we use when we talk with our customers to figure out where they are in the process. And we were able to use the electric power industry to build this because as of 2010, they had to operate and maintain their systems in full compliance. So how do we go from ad hoc, build a security program, staff that program, get all your technology deployed, and then operate and maintain that system? So as we ask these questions with our customers, we try to figure out what phase along this maturity model that they're in. And usually it starts at the beginning. Just like Ralph said in the last presentation, knowing your inventory, knowing what sites are critical, defining your security standards, and also defining a common architecture model is the start of it. If you think about pen testing, that should happen after the system's already secured, not at the beginning. So assessments, also doing acceptance testing of the system, that all starts at the beginning, at the phase one. So if we want to try to build a roadmap of how to take you from the beginning to an operate maintain mode, first we have to define our target state. And we're going to have more presentations on frameworks. We had some earlier today. But defining your target state usually means picking a framework that you're going to try to use as your golden measuring stick of where you want to be. And we had alphabet soup full of things to pick from. Fortunately, a lot of these were distilled into the NIST CSF, and which has references to a lot of these other standards. I think it's a really good framework that can be used as a definition of the target state for your system. Obviously, it's going to have to be customized for your specific operating requirements, but it's a good framework. And I'm not going to go through that framework. I'm just going to say in terms of the controls that you should have in place and the policies and procedures, that side of it can be covered by the NIST CSF. And so if you have your set of controls as your target state, what you need to do next is determine what is your current state of your system. And just doing a self-assessment with a framework is not going to give you the whole picture. For example, a couple years ago, we were at a power plant in the East Coast, and the customer had done their own self-assessment with NIST CSF, and looked pretty good, looked pretty healthy. But then they hired us to go out to a sample of their power plants and conduct boots on the ground assessments of the actual controls that's in the plant. And what we found by actually doing a technical assessment, there was a lot underneath the rocks, and you have to look under the rocks to see how those systems are set up. So a true current state of the system should include not just a policy, controls, and procedures assessment, but also a technical assessment of how that system's configured and running out in the field. And most frameworks will divide their controls into procedural controls and technical controls. The technical controls are going to be things like how the systems are configured, how the architecture is set up, what ports and services are turned on, what applications are installed, what patches are installed. And we divide up the technical controls and the procedural controls into these 6 areas. It just makes the assessment easier to make sure we don't miss anything. And the current state should include the risks or gaps in the policies and procedures, and the gaps and vulnerabilities determined through the technical assessment. And when you look at the risks that are identified through both, you can boil that up into a strategic roadmap that will give you the right guidance to where you should be spending your time and attention. So I'm going to try to quickly go through how to conduct an assessment on a live operational system like a power plant or a pipeline control system without shutting it down. That's the key thing. So we're going to break it up into the work that we do on site at the plant, what we do after we leave the plant to analyze the data, and then wrapping up the report and discussing that with the asset owner. This whole timeline is typically about 8 to 10 weeks. So if you're planning to do an assessment of an industrial control system installation, give yourself time up front to go out to the plant and do the work. You're going to need time to analyze that data, time to write the report, review the report, and sign off with the report. So you usually need about 8 to 10 weeks to do this project. The type of team members you should have on your project team should involve someone strong with network protocols and logging into switches, routers, firewalls, analyzing ACLs on firewalls. You need a strong network engineer. You also need really good SCADA engineers or IT engineers that understand how the operating systems and applications work, and then probably some vulnerability researchers who can parse this data and rate the criticality of the findings. And hopefully you have some good technical writers that can boil that into a nice distilled report for the asset owner. What I've found is that those of us that are geeky and techie typically can't really write effectively. So it's good to have writers help you out with the report. So let's say before we go out to the plant, we need to have a conference call with the asset owners. You don't just want to, you never just show up at someone's plant. You always need to make sure you have the right PPE, make sure that the team at the plant knows you're coming and expect what you're going to be doing each day. Sometimes you have to have clearance and a lot of paperwork in order for some of the steps to be pulled off properly. And you want to make sure that the right resources are going to be at the plant when you go there. At almost most industrial installations, there's like one guy or two guys that knows how all of the DCS system works or how the SCADA system works. He has the plans in his head or in the back of a napkin on his desk. His asset inventory is probably in a spreadsheet on his laptop or something. And that guy needs to be there in order to do the assessment right. And let's walk through this. So if we look at conducting an assessment of an installation like this, we want to make sure that we cover physical access to the system and then go through the network architecture, the devices in the DMZ, control system, workstation servers, the protocols and communications out to the field devices, and then the embedded systems as well. You should lay out an easy way to manage the data you're going to collect from this assessment process, and make sure that you encrypt all the data you collect from the plant. Because the last thing you want to do is collect all this, traffic and diagrams and information about this critical asset and just have it unencrypted on your laptop to be stolen by somebody, right? So make sure you encrypt the data properly. Keep it encrypted at rest and in transit. So let's start at 1, physical security. These are some HD glasses that record everything as we're going through the process, just to make sure we understand where all the camera angles are, how high the fences are, what's the procedures from going from a public location down into the control room. Usually the physical security process is not the main goal of the assessment, but you want to make sure that if they're governed by NERC SIP or let's say CFATs, that those physical requirements are there at the facility. The main part of the physical security review is to make sure that those assets used to manage the plant are being physically protected properly. So that the switches and cabinets are locked, access to the control room resources are locked, and the right assets are being, so that physical security and cybersecurity are interwoven properly. After you do the walkthrough of the plant and check off all of the physical tests, then it's helpful to break up the team so that your network engineer is going to be doing all the network analysis, and then the IT or SCADA engineer is going to be working with the operations in the control room to capture data from the computers. And then you want to make sure that you have a project manager that's coordinating the meetings and capturing the notes. And a big key here is to make sure that you don't initiate any tools or scans or captures without full knowledge of those in the plant. So where do we start? We always like to start with capturing network traffic because it's it's a passive step that doesn't alter the state of the plant. We can request for a span port on switches that support span ports, or we can use a network tap device at core parts of the network. And what that allows us to do is make sure that the current state of that system doesn't already have malware, that the protocols that are in place at each part of the layer of the system are appropriate for what should be. And it also allows us to make sure there's no outbound traffic to places that that traffic shouldn't be going to. Also, I would note here, we typically do not do any active scans of any network segments that are lower down the system than a DMZ. I don't know why it's flipping around like this. Oh. Yeah, so we don't suggest that you run Nessus or Nmap or any type of vulnerability scanner on live OT systems, because they can have a potential of causing an embedded device to reboot or come back without its configuration. So everything I'm talking about here is passive tools and a passive mindset. We like to capture traffic going outbound to the corporate IT network or out to the towards the public network away from the OT network. We want to capture traffic in the DMZ or one or more DMZs, capture traffic between the different servers and workstations in the control room. Also capture traffic going out to the field and get a good profile of all the different protocols in place. We like to use TCP Dump in order to capture traffic. You can also use Wireshark. That's the specific syntax that we use when we capture traffic in plants. If you were to perform vulnerability scans, you want to do this on networks outside the OT network, and this just breaks down the difference between ARP scans, port scanners, and vulnerability scanners. Make sure you know your tools, and just don't point and click tools when you're inside a live network. We also want to test the servers and workstations for vulnerabilities, and you can do this by manually going through these servers and workstations. Or you can use a script to collect the operating system, the patches, installed applications, the users, groups, permissions, local security policy, the active ports that are open, services running in those ports. So basically we want to get the configuration of the servers and workstations and their current state so we can determine if that system has vulnerabilities on it without having to scan it with a vulnerability scanner. So if I can't scan a machine inside a plant because it's running, and what we need to do is extract the configuration of that machine and look at it offline. So either manually or using an app or a USB mobile app or using a script, we want to collect that information and then analyze it offline. We wrote a tool called RedCat that does that, helps us review the configurations of servers and workstations quickly without impeding the local operations. So what we're talking about is we're working through this assessment process from physical access, network architecture, DMZ, servers and workstations, and we're working our way down through this process of collecting data along the way in the plant. And when we get down to the embedded controllers and the protocols down there, we have to be even more sensitive about our approach, because if the computers that are used for HMI, for visualization or archiving that data to a historian, if those go down, what do you think happens to the plant? Let's say you've got a control room with all the workstations. If all the computers in a plant instantly blue screen, what happens to the plant? But would the plant still run? Or do you think the plant would shut down immediately? Yeah. Now, what happens if all of the controllers went to a faulted state? Exactly. So usually we like to start from an outside-in approach because the risk level goes much higher when you get towards the DCS controllers and ICS embedded devices. So when we get down here, we definitely don't want to use any active scanners. We want to take our time and do it with a passive collection process. Now, if you want to know if your controllers have vulnerabilities, and you want to see how they will behave if they were scanned or a bunch of network traffic landed on their ports that wasn't the right protocol, you could use devices in a test bed to do this. So most plants have a test environment, or they might have some spare parts, and that's where you can beat up these devices. You can scan them with vulnerability scanners, you can flood traffic at them, you can test them for vulnerabilities. You want to make sure that you understand all ports that are open. So that's how you would do that. Definitely don't do that in the controllers that are live. So at this point, we should have collected information all along the way. And now we're going to be ready to start analyzing that data offline, because a lot of the data that was collected, such as the configuration files, the traffic, the profile of the workstations and servers down to the controllers, was just captured from the plant and we left the plant. So now we need to analyze that data offsite. And this is just some of the roles and activities that each of the team is going to do offline. The network engineer is going to analyze the configuration files and the traffic captured. The SCADA engineer is going to look at all of the data that was extracted from the servers and workstations, and they're going to create a set of vulnerabilities related to the host systems, and then we're going to collate all that information and rank the criticalities when we build the deliverable. So let's break down what each of these offline analysis involves. So when we get the configuration of the firewalls, routers, switches, these config files have to be reviewed to make sure that those systems are effectively programmed, because the devil's in the details. Just because you have a Cisco ASA firewall doesn't mean it's programmed properly. So you have to go through the ACLs, check for that you have the right SNMP configuration, check to make sure the firmware is up at the right level. Look at the use of SSH for admin of those devices. This is just a few of the steps that we go through. You could also, in addition to manually going through the configuration file, you can also use tools to help you check the configuration of these devices. There are third-party commercial tools that can assist you in looking at common programming mistakes for firewall switches and routers. You also want to go through the PCAP files you captured at the plant and make sure that these systems don't already have malware in place. Make sure that the protocols should not be in clear text, hopefully. Look at potential broadcast storms, excessive net flows from a specific host. If you ranked the transmit receive from a packet PCAP file, and it showed that there was one device in the network that had like 80% of the traffic coming to it or 80% of the traffic leaving it, that might be a host that you might want to look more closely in. Unless it's a server or workstation that is in a role like an OPC server or a Pi server that should be collecting a lot of traffic or sending a lot of traffic. If you have an operator workstation that's talking the most of all devices on the network, maybe it's been compromised and maybe it has malware that's doing all of that communications. I'll show you a couple tools that helps you go through PCAP files easier as we go through these slides. So you also want to do a protocol breakdown, in terms of if I see a lot of POP3, HTTP, this is indicative of something that should be up closer to the IT network, right? I shouldn't see email services and web services down on the plant floor, right? So if you take each layer of the system, the protocols present in each layer should as a gut check feel, tell you, okay, this makes sense. We like to use a tool called ComView, and then what you could do is you can take the PCAP file, you can throw it into this tool and it will give you a matrix view of all of the sessions in place. So in this case, I can see that we had one machine talking to these others on one VLAN, and we had a touchscreen talking to another PLC and another VLAN, and then we had another little system over here in 3 separate VLANs. So the viewing of the live sessions of what machines were talking to other machines also helps you validate that the system is operating properly. And if you see a whole bunch of machines talking outbound to a IP address that's not in your domain, and you don't have control of that IP address, that will also tell you that you've been compromised. We also like to sort the hosts, like I said before, by the ones that sent the most traffic or received the most traffic. And we want to make sure that doing that protocol analysis is important and make sure that the guts of the system is working and the infrastructure is set up properly. We're also going to take the results from any vulnerability scans, if we were allowed to scan any systems with vulnerability scanners, and add that to a list of vulnerabilities. And then summarize the findings on the network side based on the device configuration gaps, the traffic dumps, and the vulnerability scan. So that's going to give us a holistic picture of the network side. How are the network devices configured, and how is the infrastructure communicating? And for each vulnerability or finding, we want to make sure that we break out what was the vulnerability, what's the severity level, what's the description, what's the impact, what are the systems affected, and we got to make a vulnerability finding for each security finding that was discovered. Now, when you're looking at the servers and workstations at each host, you might want to make sure that the right patches were installed, you don't have excessive installed applications, the user group's permissions are all set up properly, you don't have any stale or vendor default accounts. Like, these are the typical things that we always find in DCS, HMIs, operator workstations, OPC servers, Pi servers. Make sure you don't have excessive network connections to unknown devices. This is just a short list, but these will kind of let you understand the state of the configuration of that server or workstation. You can also go down to the application level and make sure that the application is hooked into the OS properly, that the user has the least privileged access on the machine so that the operator can't do Control-Alt-Delete and get out of the application into the operating system and install their own applications. And then lastly, you can also look at application-to-application level security to make sure that the different apps in the SCADA system are talking to each other appropriately. Then you can summarize the results from your field controller testing and wrap all those up into a draft report, compile the findings, review that report with the asset owner, and then there's going to be a back and forth process of redlining that report until you get to a final report, which is the end of the assessment process. And that's why we said this takes time to do an assessment on a live plant, because it takes about a week on site at the facility, about 2 to 3 weeks off site to do all that analysis I was talking about, and then probably another week or two, a couple weeks to just go through that report refining process with the customer. Let's pass through here real quick. So how do we build a strategic roadmap, or how do we use the findings of our assessment to further our ICS program? When you go through the policies, procedures, controls review, you can rate your ability to be compliant with each control by high, medium, low. And there's the tool that we talked about that has the self-assessment will give you a rating from 1 to 5. You just basically want to find out what controls have the highest risk or gap on the policies and procedures side. And then on the technical side, you're also going to rank all your technical findings with high, medium, low, so that you can go after the most critical gaps on the technical side and on the control side together. Because you want to start with the end in mind. What you want to do is make sure that at the end of your assessment, you have an actionable plan that you can then reduce the greatest amount of risk in the shortest amount of time. So that way, when you look at the next 2 or 3 years out, you're going to attack the greatest amount of risk on the technical side and the control side in that first year out. It's kind of like, let's say I had a whole bunch of risk determined on the detection side, and also had a lot of risk on the protection side. What would we do first, right? Well, if you're building a house, and you're not going to worry about the alarm system on the house if the house doesn't have any doors and windows. So you have to think about, protecting the assets first, and then doing the detection and incident response secondly. You can also do a threat assessment by basically laying out the typical threats, external, internal, and physical, and then you take the technical controls and list them out, and also you can color code them as well to see your biggest risks or gaps. Then you can do your policy controls, and if, for example, a threat actor was able to defeat a technical control like a misconfigured firewall or a unpatched server, and then usually the policies, procedures would help protect from a deficiency on a technical side. But if you have also a policy or control that's at a high risk in the same area of a technical control, that's a greater chance that that threat actor is going to be able to disrupt a potential business, part of your business that's relying upon those controls and that technology. And this just kind of gives you a way to understand where the biggest risk is. Because, a threat that can exploit missing or soft controls, it can elevate those to a higher level of risk than what was determined during the assessment. So it kind of gives you a way to really determine where to place your efforts. Because risk is not determined by threat motivation. We get this all the time when we talk to our customers, like, why would someone want to target me? So they think that risk is determined by the motivation of the threat actor. But in 90% of cyber incidents, the victim of the attack was not the intended target. So you have to kind of take that out of your mind. Risk is really determined by a combination of system susceptibility and the ability of the threat to assess that device. So, for example, unhardened, unmanned assets and then a vulnerable architecture and weak configurations allows the threat actor to access the target. So if the system assets are vulnerable to exploitation, you have vulnerabilities in your firewalls or in your hosts, your workstations, your protocols, and the threat can access those assets with relative ease, then the system is in a high-risk state. Because if you look at what's required for an exploit to be successful, it's inside this part of the bubble, right? So you want to remove that chance of exploitation. And what we found over doing ICS assessments since pretty much 2002 is that most ICS systems are operating in a high-risk state. And we've just been lucky, like other presenters have said before. So we went through and defined our target state. We went through and conducted this technical assessment and controls assessment to determine our current state. So now what we want to do is take the high, medium, and low findings from the framework assessment and the technical assessment and roll it up into a strategic roadmap so we can present this to management and get funding to start fixing these gaps. And what we like to do is take all of the high risk critical findings from the technical side, from the assessments we did at the plant, and also the highest priority control gaps from the NIST framework assessment, and put those together into a year one plan. So say I want to take all the reds and oranges out of my gaps, basically tackle the highest risk items first. And then we'll take the medium priority gaps in the framework and the medium vulnerabilities found in the on-site assessments of those plant assets and put those into the next year focused, and then the low priority do in the third year. And sometimes you can accelerate this or push it out depending on your availability of funding. This is an example roadmap we put together back in 2014 for one of our customers. And we ended up doing, after the 3-year rollout of their roadmap, we went back and did another combined NIST, CSF assessment, and technical assessment of a sampling of their plants around the world. And we were able to see a huge difference in their risk rating by using this kind of mindset to knock down the risk in a 3-year way. And so some of the key findings of doing this is that it resonates well with management, because when you ask for a budget to fix things, now you have a very thought-through methodology for doing it, where the high, medium, and low risk can be mapped into a strategic plan. These are some of the customers that we use this approach for. We've been doing this same approach for the past 6 years, using the NIST CSF framework for the controls and procedures review, and then using the on-site process to get the technical view of those and validating that those controls are actually in place or not in place, and then rolling that up into a strategic roadmap, and then having the customer go through that roadmap and knock down those gaps over 3 years. So in summary, ICS operational systems are no longer proprietary, as we talked about in the first part of the presentation. ICS systems are more vulnerable now because they look and feel more like IT systems. And your system is probably going to be impacted by either malware or a threat actor that was not intentionally targeting your system. We do have some customers that were hit by ransomware and their plant had to shut down to rebuild all these systems. And the threat actor wasn't targeting them with the ransomware. The ransomware was actually just opportunistically spreading, and it hit their IT network, and then it rolled into their plant network. So make sure that you understand where your risks are so that you can reduce the chance of these types of attacks impacting your operations. And usually that involves first figuring out what the target state looks like, what framework you want to comply with, compare the current state of the system to where you want to be as a desired target state, and then use those gaps as a way to build a strategic plan to drive you towards that target state. So with that, I'll open it up for questions, because we have 5 minutes left, and I'm the one standing between you and the food.
All right, we'll start with a question here in the back.
Thanks, appreciate the presentation. How would you address responses that you come in, you scan, you find obsolete systems, things that aren't patched, those things we already know about, right? They're already mitigated in other ways. And then there's kind of the second part to that is, so you come in, but if you're already starting on L3, aren't you already sort of cheating by doing your testing when you need to really start and test the threat vectors?
I'm sorry, what was that again?
Wouldn't you really need to test the threat vectors and not just start on L3, right, as you're testing?
No, what we want to do is go from all the layers of the system, from physical security and the IT side down all the way down to the lowest level of the controllers, because you have to get a holistic feel of the risk. So, for example, if I have a touchscreen running on Windows CE or Windows XP, we're not going to say that it's a critical finding if it's got other layers of protection ahead of it, or if it has a compensating control such as whitelisting and it has IPS appliance in front of it, and only this one device can talk to it over this port, right? So you have to be realistic about the findings that you have, and you have to realize that some of these systems probably are never going to be replaced, but they still should be called out, because you don't want to allow someone to just give the excuse that, oh, well, I can't replace this because they don't have an upgrade path to Windows 10.
All right, I think we have a question in the middle here.
So when you go in and do passive monitoring in a DCS system and that sort of stuff, what level of problems have you encountered on actually getting that stuff? Do you tap it? Do you span the switches? Do you change the configuration when you're in there working on that? And if so, have you run across any problems where you're on, some old Cisco whatever switch or some different brand or something that you can't actually get the data? How do you deal with that to get that passive data off of the DCS?
Yeah, that's a good question. We had 1 or 2 examples where older Cisco switches, older than like 2800 error catalyst. If they're older than that, you're probably not going to get like a full span port. You might have to span just like a few ports at a time. When you do a mirrored port, you're not altering the state of the configuration, number one, because you're just going into memory and you're setting up a monitor session, and you're copying all the traffic from the ports to another port, your destination port, and then when you're done with the capture, you just say no monitor session 1, and it comes out. So you're not ever changing the configuration of the switch. You are going to tax the switch with a little bit more work because it's going to have to copy every port over to the mirrored port. But most switches, if they were bought within the past 10 years, are no problem, right? However, some of these plants have switches that are like 30, 40 years old, right? Or maybe don't support a mirrored port. We like to use, it's like a Chinese star network tap. It's unpowered. It has four different like connections on it. You're going to have to break the connection for about 2 seconds. There's going to be a drop in traffic as you pull that uplink port, plug the tap in, and then put your laptop in the tap. So in some cases, especially in the DCS side, you may have to get like a job permit filled out if there's going to be a stop in traffic even for 2 seconds. Or they may want you to, because if you tap the primary and they see a gap in, the DCS may roll to the secondary. And then in some cases, if then you go try to tap the secondary, it may not roll back to the primary properly, right? So just you have to be careful when you're inserting a network tap. And oftentimes we would do that at the highest part of the network and try not to tap it down at the controller level.
Okay, so more like at the root switches, that sort of thing?
Yes, root switches, core switches are great. We're all, and then sometimes you have like your LAN A, LAN B on the PCN side, and you have another network leg that all of the operator workstations and historians are on. You want to tap that leg too.
Okay, cool, thanks.
You're welcome.
All right, we may have time for one more quick question. If not, please join me in thanking Jonathan. Thank you very much.
Thanks.